Changing gears a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about the OpenVSP community. This is not just a little preface. This is not a complaint or a gripe. There's just some facts in here that may surprise people or may not. But we'll go through some of this, and I'd just like to point out an opportunity for everyone to help and make things better. So I'll just dive in. So VSP's history goes back to the early 1990s, developed at AIMS. It was released as open source in 2012 as OpenVSP. And that's really when I forked it from sort of direct NASA control being developed in-house at NASA to being something developed out in the open. And when it was open sourced, some people asked me, Rob, how do you deal with all the flood of contributions and bug fixes and features coming in from all the community, right? Because that's how people think open source works. And again, not a complaint. I love my users, but that's not the way it works for OpenVSP. In some cases, you could imagine if you were writing a C compiler in the C language, then the Venn diagram of your potential users and your potential developers has lots of overlap. Someone who is a C programmer who uses a C compiler could potentially be able to contribute to and willing and interested in contributing to a C compiler written in C. But when we're talking about a tool for doing aircraft conceptual design, that's my set of users, people who do aircraft design, which is amazing. But then the skills needed to develop it are, really hairy 3D numerical algorithms and geometry algorithms in C++. And so, the Venn diagram of OpenVSP users and OpenVSP developers has very little overlap. And again, this is not a complaint. This is just an observation. And so, we don't get a lot of open source contributions, and that's okay. Again, we have users that are users. And development is also not free. People think that it's all a big volunteer effort in open source land, and that's really not true either. The people who develop it on OpenVSP, almost without exception, have always been paid to do so. And whether that was, me now as a consultant or when I was a professor, and I would then pay graduate students to work on it, or other contracts with companies like M4, development has been paid, and all the developers are sort of one degree of freedom removed from Rob McDonald. I do donate my time for things like support on the Google group, and I donate the web hosting and the web registration, some small things like that. But the time that goes into VSP, right, and the predecessor when it was RAM and not OpenVSP, those were all paid contracts and supported development work. And of course that controls where the development effort goes, right? The person paying the bills is the one who gets to pick which feature gets implemented next. So there's a lot of perceived, and some of these are real, barriers to contributing to OpenVSP, right? It is a daunting source base. It's more than 300,000 lines of C++. There's extremely little documentation, or as I like to say, the code is the documentation. The build system is complicated. We've got many, many dependencies, and all those libraries have to be compiled and all have to work. And that's a very complex build system. The code itself, to make big contributions, it gets into some really, hairy cutting edge geometry and numerical algorithms. And frankly, it's such a large code base that for a lot of people, even if they want to do something simple, they don't even know where to start. And so the first thing I'll say is if you want to do something to VSP, ask. In general, I find that I can tell someone where to start. Hey, you want to do that? This is how I would go about it. And I would start in such and such files, and you're going to want to modify this class, and that's going to interact with this other class, so watch out for that. And I can give that kind of advice. And in my experience, that advice saves about 2 weeks on whatever job you're looking to do. So I can really accelerate getting people started on projects. And I know this is daunting and scary, but at the same time, it's really not as bad as it looks. There's a lot of grad students out there who I see develop incredibly elaborate scripts and Python scripts and other tools to work around a feature that does not exist in OpenVSP when they could have fixed it in like 5 lines of code. So oftentimes the easiest way to fix something or the easiest way to do something is just to do it in OpenVSP. And there's all these barriers to doing that, but I promise it's really not that bad. And I can try and help. Speaking of help, documentation is something where OpenVSP it has very little. I try to make the user interfaces very intuitive so that a process of exploration and trial and error is going to be the best way to learn things. Brandon has made amazing contributions to create the VSP Ground School, that set of videos that walk through everything in small bites at lots of different levels of users from beginner to expert. But there's not a lot of traditional documentation, and I struggle with it. I struggle in part because, of course, I'm not exactly sure what documentation would be most useful. For example, I don't think it's useful to document what every single parameter does on every single component. The wing sweep parameter adjusts the wing sweep, and I don't really think that a paragraph telling you that wing sweep adjusts wing sweep is going to be beneficial. So that's one problem that I struggle with, is knowing what to document and at what level of detail. I also struggle with the question of, if everything were documented, would anybody be able to find it? If documenting VSP completely created a 400-page PDF document, would anybody ever be able to find what they're looking for? What are the keywords? Is it searchable? Is it intuitive? Searching doesn't matter if you don't know what the keyword to search for is. So there's a lot of struggles around making good documentation, but there's also opportunity to help. So about 2 years ago, I added the ability to have online help in OpenVSP, and most people probably haven't even noticed it because very few things have been populated with this kind of documentation. But the first thing that got it was the advanced linking capability. I wrote a document, sort of a programming guide for advanced linking. But I didn't just write that documentation. I wrote an entire ability so that people can easily add documentation to VSP. So in this case, if you look in the VSP source tree, in the source directory, there's now the help directory, and there's a file in there called advancedlink.markdown. MD is a kind of online file that has some very easy to use formatting built in. And the contents of that markdown file is this black screen over on the right, opened in a text editor. And so you can see the markdown is things like these 3 dashed lines and the word title to identify that as a title. Here's a link to a file to include an image. Down here we have a heading with 2 hashtags. And then we have a table with some vertical bars and colons in order to format that table. So this is what markdown looks like. We can even include something that will be formatted to look like it's C++. Oops. We can also format things to look like math. So we can include equations in here. So we can write this markdown file. And then what I've done is, if you then want to tell the advanced links to then show that markdown file in the constructor of the advanced link screen, all constructors for screens in VSP now have this. All you have to do now is tell it what's the file name for the help file. And we wrote it in Markdown, but notice here it shows up in HTML, and that's because we're going to convert it from Markdown to HTML. So all you have to do to add help to OpenVSP is write a Markdown file and then put the name of that file on the constructor of the screen you want it to appear with. And you'll notice that then when we run that screen, when it's compiled, that screen will get a little question mark up in the upper right-hand corner. And that question mark will open up a browser and will show you that online help. And so that's all it takes to add help to any screen that you might want to. So behind the scenes, what happens here is, if you have Pandoc, which is a utility that converts from one document format to another, it's sort of a Rosetta Stone of Markdown files. And so we use it to convert that Markdown file to HTML. So if pandoc is found, what we're going to do is all the markdown files are going to be copied from source help into build source help to the build directory. We're going to copy any resource files with them, so any image files that go with that. Pandoc is going to process the markdown, creating the HTML, and then we're going to copy that HTML into the installation package, the zip file that you download from the website. And we're also going to copy that HTML to source help HTML. So we're going to make an archived copy of that. So here's the source directory, the build directory, and this is a representation of the installation package over here on the right. So this is how the sausage is made, but this is how I copy things around. Now, if you're on a computer that does not have pandoc, then what we're going to do is, since it can't convert directly from the markdown, what it'll do is it'll copy whatever version of the HTML is in the source help directory. It'll copy that to the installation package. So what this means, let me back up, is if you have pandoc, it'll work from that raw markdown file, and it'll copy it then into the source and make that archived copy. And then that archive copy will be used for anybody who doesn't have pandoc. So again, most people this won't matter because the distribution binaries are built by me through a GitHub process that has pandoc. And of course, on my machine, I have pandoc. So you don't have to worry about all this for the most part. Now, you can actually, GitHub will render markdown files and make them look pretty. And so you can actually browse on GitHub and go into the source help directory, and you can look at all the different help files that exist. And when you click on them, it's going to show you them with the graphics and with some formatting. And that's great. You can go and you can browse the help without any sort of additional, infrastructure. But you can even edit the files on GitHub. And so GitHub will allow you to edit and create files right there from the browser. And so if you wanted to change, if you find a typo in documentation and you want to make a change, you can just go to GitHub. You can go to that markdown file. You can click the little pencil to edit it, and you can then edit that file online, make the changes to that file. And when you save it, it'll make a pull request and it'll send that to me to be included into VSP. And it's that easy to contribute to OpenVSP and to contribute to the documentation. And you can not only do that editing an existing file, but you can also do that to create a new file. So if you find that, hey, here's a GUI that I think could use some documentation. It confused me when I first used it, but I figured it out and I think I understand it, and my understanding would help other OpenVSP users. All you have to do is go to GitHub, go to the help directory, tell it to create a new file, create a new markdown file, write your documentation, create a pull request, and you're off to the races. So I'll show some of this here in just a moment. And that's basically the gist of all this. And I'll do some demo just to show you guys what it actually looks like. First, I'll come to GitHub. So here is here's the GitHub page at the top for the OpenVSP project. And so to find the help, we come into the source directory. And we navigate from the source directory, we come into the help directory, and you can see here are the markdown files that have been created. And if I click on one of them, like the advanced link, you'll see that it immediately renders that, and it shows it in a nice format. It formats the code, it formats any equations, which I don't think this one has equations. But it formats everything just like it'll show up in the browser later on, and including links. So that's what it looks like here in GitHub. If we just do that, we can also come over here and we can edit the file. And to edit and do a pull request, you need a GitHub user account, and you need to be logged into that account. So you'll need to do that. But all you have to do is click edit, and here you are. You're in a text editor, and you can just come in and make whatever changes you need to do. You can preview what that's going to look like in Markdown, so that you can switch back and forth. And then you can come up here, and once you make some changes, you can commit those and create a pull request. If you want to put images in, then you need to upload those images to the images directory and just choose a file name that nobody else has used so that we don't have conflicts. Choose a unique file name. And you can upload, if we come here to the images directory, you should be able to add file. And through add file, you can upload a file. So if you've taken a screenshot of OpenVSP and you use that to talk about it in your help document, you can upload that file here to the images directory. And then, you can come here to the markdown file that you're working on, and we'll just view it raw. And you can see here, this is what a link to an image looks like. And so you can format that as you want and create that file. Now, the other thing that you have to do in order to make this work, this is a little bit more, in the weeds, but if you write documentation and you don't do this next step, don't worry about it. Just in the pull request, tell me that you didn't add the link to the screen constructor, and I can take care of that. But just to show you, if you want to do everything, you can just come in and, for example, that advanced link screen, here's that line of the constructor. It's right at the top of the file where that file name exists. And so all you have to do if you want to add that help file is just come in and find, which one of these screens it was for. The other one that we just saw was the set editor. So we'll come down here to the set editor screen. Let's see, set editor screen. And we'll see right here is the link to setedit.html. And so all you would have to do if you wanted to add one to something else, say you wanted to add something to the structure screen, you'll see it doesn't have a file name down here. It just has these empty quotes. So what you would do is you'd come in, you'd edit it, and then you'd come in and you'd say, you know what, this is going to be structures help.html, and then you would commit that change. So that's all it really takes to, and yes, I'm going to discard those changes from now. So that's all it takes. And of course, if you don't want to use the GitHub web interface, you can pull down a copy to your local machine. You can make these changes in your local text editor of whatever text editor you like or your IDE, and then you can push them back up. But my goal here was to reduce the barrier as much as possible so that anybody could contribute this stuff. And I'll just go and run VSP. You'll see that in the distribution, this directory is just like you would download. There's nothing special here, but here's that help directory that includes all these files, including those images. So all that gets put, the infrastructure, the behind the scenes takes care of getting that all the right places. And if we run VSP and we come in and we come to the set editor, for example, you'll notice there's now a question mark up here. And when we click it, it loads a browser and we can see that documentation that was contributed by Jason last year. Or we can come in here and we can go to the advanced link and we can click there and it pops up that advanced parameter linking documentation that we've been talking about. And so, this is a new capability for documentation. If if we end up with a lot of this, which is hopefully I would like this to grow, and when we come here to this help directory, we're displaying it online. You have to click here on each one. But certainly there's also the possibility that we could have GitHub automatically process these markdown pages and create then another documentation page, which would be a very friendly, way to come and browse these things. And certainly we have this index markdown file where if we add these things to it, which is certainly something we can do. So we should come and we should add links to the set editor help and to the other help screens that we have, which I think is an attributes related, attribute explorer markdown. So we should add each of those to that index, and hopefully through that we can build up some documentation in another way. So with that, I can take any questions. This was a pretty short talk for this one.
Thanks a lot, Rob. We just had, excuse me, a couple of chats here on the side, but popped in. So one of them, get your input on it. There was a question about whether setting up the help makes more sense to kind of do it the old style on the wiki pages like we had done in years past, or if the the kind of current and future push for any help is to set things up on the markdown pages. I was leaning towards the markdown and these help files. Would you agree?
Yeah, that would be my preference. The wiki was good because it provided another way to make it easy so that anybody could contribute. All you had to do was ask me for a wiki username, and then you could have access and edit it. We used to have that open for everyone, but we got a lot of spam bot vandalism, and so I had to shut that down so that it's a request process. So if you want access to the wiki, just email me and I'll do it. Um, the problem with the wiki, and not a lot of people did things, and of course it got out of date. This is always the problem with documentation. But the other problem with the wiki is we do have users who use VSP in an environment where they don't have an internet connection, whether they're on travel or whether they're on an air-gapped computer or whatever the other situation. And so the wiki wasn't always fully available to them. The nice thing about this system is that the help becomes, entirely integrated into VSP, and all of the files are copied along with the distribution. And while it does load in a browser, that browser, you'll notice here, is accessing a local file. It's not actually reaching out over the internet. So as long as there is a browser on the computer, it'll be able to render and show those files. So um, and then there's really nothing better than having that documentation, in the GUI so that you can click on that question mark and have it pop up. So that's why we kind of prefer the um the markdown files. The other, hypothetical advantage, if we had a lot of documentation, would be that the markdown files will always match the version of ESP that you're running. Whereas the wiki, there's only sort of one wiki for all users. So conceptually, if we had a lot of documentation and it was keep being kept up to date, then and you wanted to go back and run an old version of VSP for some reason, then when you ran that old version of VSP, you'd get an old version of the documentation, and when you ran a new version, you'd get a new version. So having integrated into the same release process and the same version control has some nice advantages. But mostly, it's just about trying to lower the barriers so that people can contribute documentation. And what I would encourage, I've talked about my weaknesses of documentation, not knowing what needs to be documented and other things like that. Don't don't worry about from your standpoint. If there's something that you don't know the exact details, or you're worried if something's not correct, I'd say write something, put in a pull request, and I'm not just going to blindly put it up there. I'll go through and I'll edit it, and I'll make any clarifications, or I'll make any corrections if you get something a little bit wrong. But you starting that ball rolling and saying, identifying this is something that needs to be documented, and this is what would help me. This is what would have helped me understand what's going on here. That's a huge help, and then I can just go through, and I can nitpick it and make sure that it's technically correct in case you're worried about, if your understanding is incomplete. So um, that's the hope here.
Yeah, thanks for the insight there. And as you were talking, I was just reminded that someone emailed me, oh gosh, it might have been weeks ago now, and pointed out that the ground school, everything in the OpenVSP GUI, all of the help, everything is in essentially American English. And we have a lot of international users where, some of this stuff, the language barriers are a very real thing. And while that's not something that, you or I can tackle, I think with, some of the advent of things like, I don't know, a language model that happens to be particularly big, one could go through and maybe adjust some of these things to a translated version that was more accessible to our folks around the world that, maybe English isn't a first language. But since we were on the subject of the help, I thought that that would be kind of an interesting thing to bring up while we were recorded here because I had almost forgotten.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, so there are technologies that exist to make internationalization of software easier on developers. And so, for example, there are programs that you can manipulate a source code base with that'll go through and identify all the strings that are in a program. And then it'll dump those out to a text file. And then you can go through and come up with translations so that you can take that file and you can translate all of those strings, to French, to German, to Chinese, to Russian, to whatever you want, and you can create all these different things. And then when you compile it, it will then substitute. It'll go find where's that French string and it will substitute it in. So that is there are tools to help with that. Um, it would be a lot of work, and I don't anticipate that any of my past sponsors would pay me to do that. But certainly, if someone in the open source community, who had the skills in C++ to go through and build up that infrastructure to support translations, I would accept those changes. And then that would give the opportunity for then people of all the different languages that wanted to then just go create the translation. So the infrastructure first, the translations later, would be another great way for the community to contribute. I will give one warning. Um, we have had problems in the past where people are using a non-default locale on their computer. And so you can change your computer's locale, and that's a C term, a C programming language term, so that your locale will change some of the things. And so it's not just translation, but for example, it'll change the decimal point separator from a period to a comma in certain cases, and it will change things like how dates and times are displayed. Americans use a very strange month, day, year date format that the rest of the world doesn't like. And so I mention this because there have been some bugs in the past where people who've changed their locale to using a comma separator instead of a decimal, instead of a period for decimals for fraction separation, have then written out files that were incompatible. For example, I think like the step files and some of the other file formats. So I will say that if we go down this kind of internationalization path, there are some really strange and frustrating bugs that can come up because why does the file not work? And it turns out it's because the decimal points are now all commas. Um, but yeah, I think that would be a path that we could certainly head down. And I think in parallel to that, frankly, the markdown files might be a lower hanging fruit. There might be an easier way with less infrastructure to convert the markdown files than the all the strings in OpenVSP. But I think both are options. I will say that another place where users could contribute is simply the Wikipedia entry for OpenVSP. The Wikipedia entry is typically pretty plain and somewhat out of date. And I only mention it because if I remember right, there was a French Wikipedia entry for OpenVSP about 3 years before there was an English one. So maybe that's another data point.